technology companies, everyone looking for talent is just waking up to this fact that we can have all of this really rich talent of STEM graduates and engineers in the same time zone as the United States, for example. They have everything, right? They're like the darling child of Latin America, I would say, that where every metric you look at, they're just doing incredibly well. Mexico has insane amounts of potential because it has all these tourist destinations that are still just mildly explored.
From Nomad Capitalist Live 2023 in Kuala Lumpur, where we've got a full house. I'm proud to be joined by the co-founder and editor of an excellent research service on investing in Latin America. It's called Latinometrics. Ernesto Canales is here with us. Glad to have you.
Very, very grateful to be here, Andrew, with you. Thank you so much for having me.
We're talking about investing in markets all over the world. A lot of people like living in Latin America. Yeah. A lot of North Americans in particular. But when you look at the long-term, let's say the last 20-year growth trajectory, you have faster growth in, let's say, here in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, for example, or Thailand. Why do you think that Latin America has been a slower growth region? And is that something that continues?
I think a big reason of that has been the fact that Latin America has boomed in a very different way as Asia has. Latin America's boom has been mostly attributed to commodities. Like you can see a boom in avocados, you can see a boom in oil in some countries, things like that. The service industry hasn't been as strong in Latin America, so I think that has left us a little bit behind what you see here in Asia, where there's a very talented workforce of software engineers, where we are sort of lagging behind in that sense, but I think that is changing in the most recent years.
So you're saying there's more of a knowledge economy coming to Latin economies, and you believe that makes up the difference in the growth?
Yes, I think that will make the difference in the next 20 years for Latin America. They've become a highly educated population, and technology companies, everyone looking for talent, is just waking up to this fact that we can have all of this really rich talent of STEM graduates and engineers in the same time zone as the United States, for example.
Nearshoring is a thing. I know people who've invested in nearshoring company. They help people hire in Colombia, countries like that. Mm-hmm. Certainly a lot of our guests here who live in North America say the time zone in Asia is a challenge for them to do their work, which makes Latin America conducive. Yeah. Are there particular countries where you see knowledge economy is a focus? Is it the larger countries like where you're from in Mexico? Are there smaller players trying to grab share?
I think it's all over the place. I think you will, if you find the right people, you will find the right talent for whatever need you have, because there are universities, people are getting more and more educated. Just a few years ago, the same trend that has been following the entire world, which is women are becoming more educated than men, like they're getting more of a college degree, you're seeing in Latin America. You're seeing that even women in Mexico, which was one of the last countries to reach that point, now women are more educated. So you see it everywhere. I think there are maybe countries that are going to be slower to.
Any that come to mind?
Any that come to mind? I mean, the stronger ones are definitely Uruguay, Argentina, Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil. Those are obviously, just because of their sheer size, they have a robust size of talent. Chile is also one that maybe is not talked about as much, but it's actually the most entrepreneurial.
Not as affordable.
Not as affordable, but it has a lot of incentives for investment. Is that right? Yeah. Does that sound right to you? I know you know a lot more about that than me. I would say, yeah, all of them. Peru has a very strong universities. Yeah, Peru has a very strong university system. You see people from all over Latin America working in New York, for example, and being very successful in the technology sector.
I'll come back to that point in one moment. I talked to some of our recruitment team and said, we want to cover more time zones. We want to be adding more language skills. I thought Mexico, 3 or 4 big cities, Argentina, and Colombia, where I have a home. Those stood out to me. Probably never thought about Peru. Uruguay, very small country, but punches above its weight, you're saying, in terms 100%. Of talent.
Yeah, they have everything, right? They're like the darling child of Latin America, I would say, that where every metric you look at for Uruguay, they're just doing incredibly well. I think that is in part because of how small they are, maybe easier to manage. But they, like you said, punch above their weight. You often see Uruguayans in like very high up positions in technology companies in the United States. I've worked for a few of them, and same for Argentinians.
You mentioned a lot of folks from Latin America in New York. When I look around the world, and we're here talking about asset havens, for example, Singapore, maybe for some Hong Kong, even secondarily for some Asians, Thailand has become kind of a secondary asset haven. In Europe, obviously, you've got Switzerland, Liechtenstein, there's a whole bunch of smaller ones. There's not really an asset haven that stands out in Latin America. I guess it's Miami.
Yeah.
Does that change at some point, both in terms of where Latin Americans want to and to put and trust to put their money, and where there's a credible, contender?
That's a great question. I don't know. I would think that there are definitely asset havens. With what you're seeing more recently, the problem that you often see in Latin America is that you might see some explosion, like for example, I don't know if you've heard the term super peso, which is of the Mexican peso, how right now it's appreciating against the dollar.
It's done great.
It's doing great. In the past 6 years, is like at an all-time high. But the problem is that how long is this actually going to last? Like, is this just a trend that we're observing because of the nearshoring trends and all of that? It's hard in Latin America because at any moment, a lot of the problem is democracies sometimes face leaders that come and kind of abuse the system. And that is a challenge always for an investor. I'm assuming that that's always a risk. That I haven't really done the comparison, but I'm assuming that a country like Malaysia is relatively more stable in terms of investing for the long term, perhaps.
You could say for a lot of folks, perhaps Panama was an asset haven. And yet, when you talk to pretty much anyone in our business, they say, there's 80-some banks in Panama. I don't recommend any of them, in the sense of every person kind of has to start at zero and go to like all the different banks. And there's kind of an emotional element almost to it, where it's like every single time it's a new process, very much in the civil law system, where you come to a lot of other countries, more of the common law approach. Okay, we know if the guy looks like this and he does this and he has this amount of money, this bank will take him. And I'm just kind of wondering, is that an element that you see investors talking about in Latin America, where you're kind of starting at zero perhaps each time?
That's a great question. I don't think, I honestly don't move in those terms of my life where I'm like looking where to invest my assets at this point. So I don't know as much about that topic of what's a good place in Latin America to.
But is it kind of, you're saying, the leaders come in, I mean, you saw in Ecuador recently, it's a country I've said, I think there's some potential. I think it's a place to own some land, have as a backup plan for yourself. And yet people then go and say, oh, well, the guy running for president gets shot. And I think people kind of paint Latin America with this brush where, it's ups and downs. Maybe the question is that done unfairly?
I think it's done unfairly because there's definitely a lot of potential if people look more closely at each individual country. Yeah. I think it's easy to label the whole region as one, but it's actually extremely different. Like, I think some people have talked recently about Paraguay, how Paraguay is like very, very much rising up the ranks. So I would investigate how feasible it is to invest in a place like that. I know that it's just the economy there is booming. Costa Rica, a lot of people don't know this, but Costa Rica has a high immigrant population, close to the United States. So like, there's all these trends that you can see, and if you pick each country apart, you will be surprised, I think, of what you can.
Paraguay is one that doesn't get talked about very much.
No.
It's one of the ones that's relatively consistently right-leaning in government. I mean, I think Latin America, South America has kind of shifted back to where most countries are now left governed.
Yeah.
Paraguay has always been this kind of open for business, low tax kind of country, and yet I suppose the scale perhaps is an issue for some people. I mean, it's a smaller country.
Yeah.
What do we know about Paraguay?
Well, we know that its energy problems are pretty much solved. Like the whole country's energy grid relies on a single dam that is gigantic, and it shares with Brazil. And so that, I would imagine, creates a lot of opportunity for the country to focus on other problems. it's kind of a mystery country. I don't know that much about it as either, but I do know that what you mentioned, it makes sense. Like the right-leaning government is more in place there. I do know that just a few decades ago they still had a military authoritative regime, and the party that was part of this regime is kind of like in power now, but it's not really the same thing. Like it's just more right-leaning, but it's a just interesting country. But I would just the broader point is that I think every country, if you look at the numbers, there's an opportunity for asset. Whether you're looking at houses, if you're looking to build a hotel, it just depends on what you're looking for. I don't think there's going to be an answer that applies to every single asset. Like put all your money into Paraguay.
All right, of course.
I think it's just going to depend on what kind of asset we're talking about.
The mystery country thing makes a lot of sense. I mean, we started talking about Paraguay 8-9 years ago. You get, there's like one stock photo on the internet of Paraguay. I mean, it's just not a place people are going. And yet I wonder, it's a frontier market perhaps on par with, let's say, a Cambodia here, where there's really not much room to go but up. And there's a lot of good things in place. Let's talk about where you're from, Mexico. 8 years ago, I was saying, why does everyone threaten to move to Canada? If their guy doesn't win the presidential election, they should move to Mexico. It's much better. A lot of folks have now taken that advice up, especially during the pandemic. Do you think that speaking of painting things with an unfair brush, do you think that where you're now living in the United States understands more about Mexico's potential? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh my God, Mexico has, I'm glad we're now talking about a country I know very well. Mexico has insane amounts of potential because it has all these tourist destinations that are still just mildly explored. We can talk about the tourism sector in Mexico exploding post-COVID. Like every single airport in the region, their numbers were declining, but Mexico actually opened up its tourism industry, and the airports actually went post-pandemic levels. Went above their pre-pandemic levels. Mexico has a lot of coastline. That means a lot of real estate ready to be developed. Of course, of Tulum, which is like the now popular European American destination to go vacation. But there are so many towns that are trying to become Tulum, and that represents a major opportunity for all sorts of things. Like foreign investment, foreign houses, people trying to move there. You see that in Sayulita. It's like a small surf town in close to Puerto Vallarta. You just see a lot of desire to develop these regions, and at the same time, what you started out saying is like the nearshoring effect of Chinese and U.S. manufacturing in Mexico, which has been present for a long time. Like a lot of the Toyotas and Japanese cars are made in Mexico and then shipped to the U.S. But that is just going to continue accelerating as companies wake up to the fact like, hey, we don't have to rely just on China to make all of these products. Like we have Mexico right here, same time zone, share the border. Like there's just so many reasons why you would want to have a presence there. And like I was saying earlier, there's so many companies that are waking up to this fact and actually setting up like a headquarter in Mexico City. It makes a lot of sense.
Because China is not cheap anymore, which is why you're seeing a lot of stuff pushed into Vietnam, Cambodia, Bangladesh. I'll come back to the point on China in a moment. Are there particular places in Mexico that stand out to you? Let's say someone wants to have just a small investment. They want to buy a property. They want some kind of small business. Are there areas where this stands out? They're open for business. It's a safe place. They want you there.
I would say Baja California, both Baja California and Baja California Sur. I would say around the Mérida area, so that whole peninsula of Quintana Roo and Yucatan, all of that is being extremely developed. So I would think that those, if anyone bought properties in those areas, which are, by the way, protected well enough than maybe some other unsafer parts of the country, properties there would probably see a big return. I would think so.
What do you see with the upcoming elections in Mexico? It's two different female candidates running for what I understand is a 6-year term, single 6-year term to replace AMLO, who people I think in our audience had some doubts about and then kept the whole country open during the pandemic. What do you see with this upcoming election? What does that mean for Mexico?
It's very interesting. AMLO gets a lot of opposition from local investors, or he used to, and I think he's kept the capitalist part of the country pretty much alive and well. You're seeing like a boom of foreign direct investment in Mexico, even in AMLO's term. He started out his presidency by canceling this really huge billions of dollar project airport that was much needed in Mexico City, and a lot of people were upset, myself, my family.
Not one of the world's best airports, I'm sorry. Lovely city, not lovely airport.
We really needed a new airport, and he said, no, I don't like some of the things that are happening here. Got rid of it, and so that started his presidency, and I think people were just afraid that, oh, this is just gonna be like anti-capitalist for his entire 6 years, but it hasn't actually been that way. I think there's, similar to the United States, states have some autonomy in terms of like how much investment they bring. Nuevo León is a northern state that maybe not talked about a lot outside Mexico, but has a ton of manufacturing investment that has been attracted by the governor and by people, businesses there. But the new race is going to be interesting. It seems likely that it's going to be a woman because both parties have a woman front running them. But the Morena, the political party of AMLO, is just, I think, too popular. It's going to be hard for the opposition to.
All the other parties, including I guess the PRI, which I seem to think was like for 7 decades up until the late 90s or early 2000s. They just ruled forever, right?
Yes.
And now they've basically gotten together with the other parties as a coalition to try and beat AMLO's party?
PRI ruled, and then PAN came in for 2 terms, and then PRI came back again, and now it's AMLO. So, like you said, yes, all of these parties outside of Morena just want Morena out because a lot of, maybe in terms of like capital attracted is doing okay, but some other things are concerning for a lot of people in the country. Like a lot of institutions have been defunded, and people are just concerned that it's all under a pretense of getting rid of corruption, but you see some of the same corruption practices in the president and in his party. We'll see. It seems like, to me, either way, it seems like Morena will keep capitalism in Mexico alive. Like that has been the case for decades.
It was interesting to see that the former president, now living in Spain, on a golden visa, which I find interesting.
Yes, and dating supermodel, I think.
Something that I give a lot of thought about is it seems like there's a lack of optimism in the West. I mean, where I'm from, the United States, people were always proud to be American. Those numbers are lower every year now. I think a lot of people are feeling more and more despondent. In Mexico, are people feeling more optimistic, more happy that to be from Mexico, happy with the opportunities, optimistic about the future?
That's a great question. I think so. I think there are more opportunities being created. People are super optimistic, especially this past year or so where the nearshoring trend really exploded. People are really optimistic that Mexico is entering a stage of growth that the rest of Latin America won't be as fortunate to have.
Because of geography.
Because of geography, luck, in a lot of ways, yes. And also relatively stable capitalist practices, I would say. So I think the middle class is growing and growing and growing, and I think people are more and more content. A lot of the immigrants that you see going through the border are actually coming not from Mexico. They're coming from Central America, Venezuela. It changes every year. But a smaller percentage of them each year are from Mexico.
Let's talk about, Mexico is a wealthier country than I think a lot of people, especially in the United States, give it credit for. I mean, if you look at the quality of its passport, it's almost as good as a U.S. passport. You can't go to the U.S. without a visa. You can't go to Australia without a visa. And maybe a few others you probably wouldn't think about. To me, that reflects that the country is wealthier than it's given credit for, but certainly maybe less distributed than you'd like to see.
Yeah, that's a big problem still in the country. I think as I was driving through here, I was seeing all the beautiful buildings, and my mom is here with me, and we were both thinking the same thing. It's like, how are there so many nice buildings like that people can actually afford and live in? Like in Mexico, there seems to be, I don't know exactly why, there seems to be a lack of desirable housing and desirable living conditions to the standard that I'm seeing here in Malaysia. And this is my first time being here, so I don't know. There's definitely, Mexico's in the top 20 of wealth in countries. Some people believe it's going to quickly come to the top 10. Again, a lot of it by geography. It services the United States, and it seems like it will rise to serve it even more in the coming years. And just being a neighbor to the most powerful country in the world, of course, gives us an advantage. The wealth is definitely there. There's a lot of wealthy people, but there's also a lot of poor people. What you can see in America, sometimes the American dream that maybe to some extent has not been as good as in the past, that just in Mexico hasn't existed. The Mexican dream of making it from bottom to top. It's really hard for people that start at the bottom in Mexico to rise to the top, and I think it's as hard as a lot of other as any country. So I think that is a challenge. We need to make it better for the people at the bottom to give them opportunities.
One of the trends that I see as countries like Mexico become wealthier is they say, are the relationships we have serving us, i.e. Mexico and the U.S.? I feel the U.S. kind of took advantage of Mexico for a while, and that perhaps Mexico is starting to say, we want to do better deals. And if that perhaps means we join what many Latin American countries are doing and working more with China, maybe we should do that. Is that your understanding of Mexico? And perhaps talk about the greater region being less engaged with the U.S.?
I think Mexico will find it hard to be less engaged with the U.S. We're just extremely dependent on them. But the governments have been extremely smart, I think, in negotiating. And just to name one example, the free trade agreement with Mexico and Canada, with the U.S. and Canada. Both of those factors of really smart negotiations and competent also economists that run the country have, I think, set us up to this stage we're in now, where the peso is really strong, investment is very welcome into the country. So yes, we will continue to depend on the U.S., but we're not going to close the door to other very interesting opportunities, like China coming and knocking our door and saying they want to produce stuff in Mexico. We're attracting a lot of Asian investment, but yeah, I don't think that the trend of serving the United States will change anytime soon. I just think that Mexico will be very smart as a whole and seek opportunities elsewhere.
But it'll almost be a system where, hey, we want to be friends with the U.S.,
yes,
but we're always going to be friends over here. We're not going to only be friends with the U.S. Perhaps would have been a better way to say that.
Yeah, I agree with that.
What about the rest? I know in Latinometrics you've talked about, I think it's 20 different countries throughout the region are now doing large deals with China. I think in one case you said the deal with China was 10 times bigger than what the U.S. is going and investing. You talked about the U.S. is much more defense-oriented, whereas China is more infrastructure-oriented. Can you talk about the general trend in this, as BRICS is dominating the headlines with China in Latin America?
Yeah, when China became one of the top second economy in the world, it went everywhere to influence, and one of the big ways that they do that is by buying up infrastructure deals and giving loans to governments that otherwise would never carry out these projects. And they've built a very, very strong relationship, especially with South America. In South America, I think early 2000s, the United States became a partner worth less than China in terms of like trade value. And now China is the top trading partner of many, many South American countries. I think most of them. I can't remember exactly which ones are the exception, but there's very few. Argentina's top trading partner is China. Brazil's top trading partner is China. So that's a huge. And one interesting fact is that 76% of the U.S. trade with Latin America is just with Mexico. So there's this disengagement of the United States with South America, where it hasn't been able to get its food into South America as well as with Mexico, just because it's close and the ties are strong, as China has. China has just knocked it out of the park in terms of finding the opportunities of trade, and it's found commodities to like power China everywhere in South America.
A lot of talk about deals with China in African countries, and some people say, hey, China's doing that to be able to grab assets when they cannot repay the loans. Are there concerns that you or others have of the same nature in Latin America?
I don't feel that, sadly for Africa, they're in a much more vulnerable spot, I think. I think for the most part, Latin American economies are resilient enough to not have to default on their debt and then China come in and buy everything up at cheap. But I do think that risk exists in certain scenarios, but not in general in Latin America. I think it's a little bit more resilient than like an African economy that might be super risky because of a lot of things.
Let's talk about the startup culture. I've seen a lot about this in Latinometrics, a lot of companies getting funded. What are some of the countries that you see on top in Latin America's startup ecosystem?
Brazil takes up like 80% of all the money from investors. Brazil, I mean, it makes sense that the biggest one is, but it's even disproportionate to its size. It just seems to have created this very entrepreneurial culture, especially in Sao Paulo. Chile takes a very disproportionate amount of investment for startups. And Mexico, very recently, like in the past 2 years post the pandemic, unicorns started coming out of the woodworks from Mexico. So I think Mexico's very early stages in terms of like the startup ecosystem. But I would say Brazil, Chile, and Uruguay in South America, in terms of like startup talent and being able to create the company, are also pretty strong. But Mexico is definitely getting there.
And are these companies that are largely targeting, obviously Brazil excluded, the Spanish-speaking world? Because what's interesting is, I mean, if you go to Europe, even if you come here to Asia, most countries don't have enough mass to where they often produce stuff for the rest of the world. But in Latin America, you've got 700-800 million people. You can largely just exist within that ecosystem. Is that what those companies are largely going after? Is that local share, or are we seeing more international focused startups?
I think there's a lot of integration desire within South America of like doing more trading within countries in South America to become a little bit more self-sufficient. But I think we're pretty far to becoming self-sufficient in the technology needs and things like that. Like we still need a lot of semiconductor help from Asia. We need that is increasingly powering everything we do. So I think we're always going to have to be open to that trade that's coming from outside of the region. I mean, I could see maybe us becoming semiconductor producers independently, but it's tough unless these companies start building more of a presence in South America.
That would be quite even a geopolitical coup to take. I mean, right now the impact of Taiwan in the semiconductor space is so huge and makes it so important to the rest of the world. To be able to have any role in that, I imagine would be, whomever would do that would be incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
Let's talk more about Brazil. I saw a while back Warren Buffett who is very U.S. focused, generally speaking, although I see he's investing in some Japanese companies, but generally U.S. focused, big believer in the United States, took a big stake in Nubank in Brazil. Talk about that and what that portends perhaps for foreign investment.
Nubank, I would say, is the prime example of a startup in Latin America actually making it to an IPO and successfully. I mean, the markets are kind of bad nowadays, but they arguably made it successfully to the stock market, are a publicly traded company. So they're I think the darling of Latin America in terms of what is possible for startups. And I think Nubank is also the probably most important fintech in the world because of its size. It's the biggest neobank in the world. It was able to get all of these customers from Brazil signed up, something that is a very big challenge for all other fintechs. In Latin America, fintech is the most common type of startup that you see because it's the biggest gap that we have is payments and banking services. You still see a lot of countries where less than half of the population even have a bank account or a credit card. And Nubank has been able to solve that problem in Brazil. So I think Warren Buffett, I don't think it meets the usual criteria of Warren Buffett to invest because it's not usually it's a large, a Coca-Cola that has been operating for a ton of years and a proven record. But he saw maybe throwing in 300 million, I don't know how much it was, into there was probably just a fun investment or something.
It's interesting. Even my tailor in Colombia, it's a pain to pay him, and he's starting to do business in New York, where I think you live. And I'm saying, maybe this is a time when banking in the U.S. and merchant processing in the U.S. would make your life a lot easier because it is hard to accept payments. And so, I mean, I'm a pretty devoted customer of his, but I could imagine there's situations where you're at a disadvantage doing business when you just can't take money. Are there other fintechs around the region that are going to do the same in other countries?
Are you familiar with Mercado Libre and Mercado Pago?
I know you talk about that one a lot. That's been a big hit.
Yeah, Mercado Libre is like the Amazon.
They don't like me when I go to Colombia because I don't use my local number. They keep banning my account because they think I'm a bot or something.
Oh, you should talk to. I bet they have awesome customer service.
Okay.
You should talk to them.
All right. It seems very interesting, and they've done very
well run. Yeah, it was founded in Argentina. It's now headquartered in Uruguay. I'm assuming there's a good reason for that. But they are a marketplace, and they're basically the Amazon of Latin America. They actually started fintech before fintech was even a thing. They were founded in the .com era, so in 2000. And they launched Mercado Pago, which is basically their now known as its fintech arm in 2001 or 2002. And that was a way to solve exactly that problem that you're talking about, accepting payments for goods sold. And now they've just evolved it to so much where you can literally apply to get a terminal and you get it delivered to your business the same day, kind of like if you're ordering a pizza and you just plug it into your phone and you can accept payments immediately. And then if you get, this is just in Mexico, but they're everywhere. If you get 100 pesos or 500 pesos transacted, then you get it free of charge, the transaction. So they've just attacked the region with solutions, and now they are becoming this very interesting bank. And their division of fintech is almost bringing now just as much revenue as their marketplace, which is huge too. So
Amazon meets fintech.
Yes, it's great. I've heard some people in New York say, a guy that I really trust on these topics says that Mercado Libre might become a competitor to Amazon. If Mercado Libre, it has operated in the most challenging countries, in the most challenging economies, so some people think that it has a shot at operating in the more rich part of the world, in the United States, maybe Europe. There's some speculation there, but it's just I would say it's the best tech company in Latin America for sure.
Countries that haven't done as well in recent years. Let's talk about Venezuela.
Yeah.
We had someone here talking about, was there a couple months ago, said incredibly affordable, solved a lot of the safety issues. not everywhere, but in many places. What do you know about Venezuela? Because it's been a mess. Is there a renaissance or an opportunity, if nothing else, for a speculator in an economy like that?
I don't know. I know a few friends there. We actually have an analyst that works from Caracas in Venezuela, and he has hope, but he definitely feels frustrated that a lot of the hope that has been maybe brought in the past of like getting rid of this non-democracy thing, which really gets in the way of anything, has just brought the country down. I think the worst thing that the country did was over-rely on oil, which is something that just moves up and down. And if you have a really bad year of oil, then the economy collapses just in 1 year because the oil prices are too low. So like just because the oil prices are too low, the revenue that you thought you were going to get in your country is like half of what you thought. So how do you even operate like that? From that stemmed like the authoritarian promise of Hugo Chavez and now Nicolas Maduro. To be honest, I haven't heard a credible opportunity of hope that that government will go away anytime soon. So I don't want to.
So you're really a speculator if you go down there.
Yeah.
If you're buying a $10,000 apartment, you're speculating.
Yeah, I would think so.
A few more questions. You mentioned large unbanked population. It's a movement for something that I think a lot of our guests and viewers are very concerned about. It's an argument for bringing in CBDCs. What's happening on the CBDC front?
I've heard that Brazil has made the most headway there of turning the real into a digital currency. That's as far as I know. That's all I know about
Nothing
that.
big in Mexico on that front.
Nothing big as far as I know. I think there's definitely some crypto interest and adoption, but nothing that I have heard that is credible that Mexico will adopt a digital currency. I think we still need to get people on bank accounts before we do something like that.
Ernesto Canales, Latinometrics, great newsletter. It's $5 a month.
Yes.
Great infographics as well. Good to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I appreciate you having me.